Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the AnthroPuzzled podcast. I'm your host, Abby Letzinger, and every 2 weeks we'll explore how anthropologists are forging unique career paths beyond the usual academic sphere. Tune in, get inspired, and start piecing together your own career puzzle within the world of anthropology. On today's episode, we have Michael Thomas. As Senior Vice President of the North American Office, Michael leads the team in connecting social science expertise to address clients' challenges in strategic areas spanning growth, innovation, positioning, portfolio, design, and communications. He specializes in making sense of hard puzzles that drive strategy, helping clients extract structure from ambiguity so they know what to ask, how to get the answers, and what to do next. With expertise in cognitive and applied anthropology as well as industrial design, Michael leverages critical thinking, multidimensional research, social science, and collaboration to help clients action cultural insight. In addition to his role at Space Doctors, Michael is an executive board member of the Society for Anthropological Sciences, where he mentors junior anthropologists, advocates for scientific perspectives in anthropology, and advances the theoretical and practical applications of cognitive anthropology. How are we doing today, Michael?
I'm doing all right. Thanks. I appreciate that.
Of course. So what exactly is Space Doctors and what do they do?
So Space Doctors is a consulting agency, and they've been around for a bit. And what they do is that they help their clients and clients across multiple sectors to understand cultural change and understand where culture is headed, how people think immersed in culture, and what culture has to do with the things that they build, with the things that they communicate, with the way they're organized. Whatever a client's problem may be, it's always going to be in some way affected by culture. And so we're the team that kind of helps them understand what that means and how to work within that.
Okay, so how does your background in anthropology influence the way you approach things like brand positioning and strategy?
Yeah, that's a great question. The way I'd answer it is this. One of the things you learn in anthropology is that all things communicate. So things can be imbued with meaning. That could show up in language, that could show up in gesture, could show up in experiences, it could show up in the way people are organized and associate with each other. But all these things are potential communications, right? And when people come up with kind of cultural ideas, they're immersed in this context and they draw upon all these different things to kind of make sense out of the world. And so what's really interesting when you apply that to brand positioning or when you apply that to strategy or some such problem like this is that I'll give you an example with brand. It's not merely how you communicate, for example, from an organization to their customer base or to the wider audiences out there. It's not really reducible to that. It's really what are you as a cultural entity? What are you as kind of a social fact in the world? And what you think you are may be interpreted differently by different audiences that are out in the world in different cultural contexts. And it can be communicated through what you say, how you behave, how you're organized, what you build, what you throw away. All these things impact kind of what you are as kind of this cultural entity, right? So when we're looking at say something like brand or positioning or strategy or something like this, from an anthropological standpoint, you tend to not think of it in strictly instrumental terms of kind of like what maybe the marketing goal would be, but you consider that also within a broader cultural context and cultural kind of space. So I think that's how, I hope that answers your question, but I think that's how anthropology and anthropological view would look at something that is maybe more traditionally kind of business or a marketing question.
Okay, so like brand positioning, that's essentially like with my podcast, AnthroPuzzled, the whole concept behind it is like it's based on anthropology. So a lot of people, when they think of anthropology, they think of things like skeletons or bones or anything like that. So the brand image is like a skull with a puzzle in it. So is that kind of like what branding is?
Well, I think that's an interesting metaphor. I come from a four-field anthropology background. And so archaeology is certainly part of it, which would include things like artifacts that you might dig up and unearth and interpret. Physical anthropology would be another part of that as well, where you're studying things like skulls and whatnot. I think when I put my lens toward what brand is and how I think of that, I would think of it as your brand is kind of your cultural entity that you create. And you can create it with some intentionality. And that's going to be what you signal into the world. That's going to be kind of what you say about who you are, what you value, what you support, what you believe in. And that's going to be communicated in all the different ways that we know, things like advertising and things like that. Even in your product form, For example, you build a car and, the way that look is going to convey your brand, whether it's the shape of the front fascia or whatever it might be. So that's going to all communicate your brand. But also, if you think of it anthropologically, there's many things about it that you may not realize are communicating about your brand that also kind of create what that existence is in the world. And these are things like how you're organized or what kind of political economy network you exist within, or how you treat your employees, or what types of technology you invest in, also communicates something. So the communication don't think of it as necessarily like a veneer or a layer that you put on something that you would otherwise do anyway. All those things communicate, all those actions, all those decisions, all those choices are in a sense communications that kind of structure what you are in a social context. I hope that answers.
Yes, it definitely did. So, how do you balance the holistic and cultural insights from anthropology with more traditional business and market research?
Yeah, well, I've done a lot of that because I've done a lot of work in kind of traditional market research and design research and things like this. And to be honest, one of the ways that they dovetail, they work really well together. So one thing that anthropology can do is you can put into context what you might learn through some other kind of research methods. So for example, if you're doing something like market segmentation, one of the things that we talk about at Space Doctors, actually this is really interesting, is one of the offers that I helped develop is, typically if you're going to look at something like segmentation, you might look at demographics of people, you might look at their income level, or you might look at how they identify in terms of ethnicity or in terms of gender and things like that. But a lot of times you may end up reproducing kind of whatever labels you've kind of invented to do that and structuring your data set that way. And not always do people kind of fit into these kind of narrowly defined spaces. Right. So one of the things you can really look at is putting a cultural context element to that as well and say, okay, well, within this particular cultural context, maybe these ways of identifying mean something a little bit different. Or maybe this way of seeing this world, or this kind of shared cultural idea about a particular topic is going to be situated in culture. And so when we look at something like market segmentation with a cultural lens, it allows you to get a lot more specific, a lot more granular, and a lot more targeted, I think. So I think that's one way that it helps. Another way that it really helps as well is, there's a lot of traditional kind of design research methods that are very much based in kind of prototype testing and usability and things that are borrowed from design thinking, or borrowed from human-centered design perspectives. And I found that a really good complement to that is doing some cultural analysis up front. And what that does is, without getting into all the details about the methodology and all that, but it can give you really quickly some construct validity so that when you're studying things in different contexts, you understand how to interpret people's responses. Because, for example, the language that you might use, even if it's the same literal language, the words you use, the connotations may mean something very different with people who are using the same words with very different connotations. So that's just a small example of how really doing some of that cultural work up front can make your kind of downstream work a lot more efficient, and it could be a lot faster. It could be a lot tighter and just more robust. So I think there's two ways that could really complement it. One would be setting that context first so that you can reference everything you're doing against that, and that gets you just a lot sharper insights. And I think another thing that's really valuable is to add some depth and nuance and some granularity to what might otherwise be like relatively generic information that you could get, but adding some of that context really kind of helps distinguish those insights from just kind of trivia.
I never really thought about it that way. Granted, I don't do a lot of market research myself, but that's a good way to kind of look at it. Is I had an individual on who did content design, and she makes sure that she goes into a lot of the initial stage meetings so that because she got her degree in biological anthropology, I believe, but she makes sure that she's in these designing processes at the forefront, because it makes her job as a designer much easier when it gets towards that part of the processing. So she can give her input of like, oh, like this population that you're trying to reach, whether it's like demographics of like young, like Gen Z or millennials, or whether you're doing West United States or East United States, the cultures are very different, even though it's the same country. So getting into those meetings, she makes the process a lot easier for herself down the line, trying to get that verbiage in for like the writing process, that kind of stuff. So it kind of sounds similar to like what you guys are doing.
Yeah. No. I think that's a pretty good analogy there. But that's just about it. It's about getting really specific early, understanding that context. Then you could put everything in that in reference to that, and then so that ensures some continuity, which is useful, reduce noise.
So, what does your day to day look like? Is it kind of like the same thing over and over again, or does it change based on the kinds of projects that you're doing?
Yeah, no, my day is different every day. It's definitely different every day. It kind of depends on where we are. So, I mean, if you look at what we do, essentially what we do is like I said, we help our clients understand cultural change and what it means for them. So, for example, if you have a client that's, let's say, designing an app, and maybe it's an app that manages your finances or something like this, and they really want to understand, like, well, how are people using financial management applications? One of the first things you kind of have to ask is, well, what is, for a specific cultural context, well, what is finance for? Why are they engaging in finance at all? And what is their cultural model of that? And typically there's going to be more than one. There's going to be quite a few different kind of, sometimes competing, sometimes overlapping, sometimes complementary, different kind of models of what a particular domain is, something like finance. So how that affects my day is that when we're working with a client, if they have a question, they come to us with a question like this. And if it's at the early end of the project, I might be writing up like kind of a pitch. Well, here's how we would answer your question. Here's how we would tackle it. And that's going to be something that involves like a research design, a research plan. And I would look at the teams that we have and the capabilities that we have. I'd look at the problem they have, and I'd find the best match and say, okay, you really need someone who's an expert in, let's say, semiotics. You really need someone who's an expert in ethnographic description, or you may need an expert who's got some design capability. Whatever that may be, we draft that plan and we kind of pitch that to the client, then you hope to land the business. So some of the days look like that. And that's a lot of like PowerPoint work and communication and meetings and phone calls and sorting things out. Once you land a project, the days can look very different. So if your project has, let's say, workshops with stakeholders and your client, that might involve hopping in a car, hopping on a plane, going out to meet them, setting up a workshop, having the right kind of stimuli there to have the right kind of conversation that's going to be kind of generative and productive. It could look like that. So another thing you might do is you might actually go on and do the field work. You might be doing the analysis. You might be doing the interviewing. You might be hosting like a co-creation session or whatever that might be. So that's another part of it. That's when you're immersed in a project. And then there's kind of the working on the business itself, which might be developing and innovating in your methods and in your approaches. It might be supporting the team and making sure that their needs are met as well, and that they're able to contribute and feel fulfilled and things like that, and kind of classic managerial type work. So it's pretty diverse. It really depends on kind of where you are in that path. And then there's content development as well. So then if there's, developing a point of view, everyone's talking about AI, for example, now, and then our clients will ask us, well, what is your point of view on this? What, are you using it? What have you found is useful? What do you think it means culturally? What do you think it means socially? And so it's kind of doing some of the fundamental research and just keeping abreast of cultural change and how things are happening in society.
How often do you have to travel for your position?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't travel all that much. I probably travel, maybe about backup. So Space Doctors is a B Corp. And if you don't know what a B Corp is, it's a big corporation that particular commitments toward regenerative and planetary health. And one of the things that we try to do is when we can work remotely, we do, because that kind of reduces what our footprint is. So with that in mind, I don't travel a ton, and that's deliberate. I would probably say once or twice a quarter. Whereas, for example, on other jobs I've had, I used to travel all the time. And to the point where it just got exhausting. So I'm a bit relieved to not have to travel quite as much. But ever since COVID, there's so much more capability and the tools are so much better for remote working that it worked really well.
Yeah, I've noticed that a lot. And it's super funny because before COVID, a lot of individuals were like, no, we can't do remote work. It's just not possible. And then COVID hit and they're like, well, actually, I guess we'll do this remotely. And then after COVID has kind of subsided, they're like, okay, we're going back into the office. And they're like, why though? Like, if I can do my work just as efficiently from my home, why do I need to make that trip into the office to do the exact same thing?
And some of the work we do, when it gets to work that's like field work, or if it gets to something like, one of the things we do that I think is it's one of my favorite things, it's one of the most interesting, is doing kind of stakeholder immersive exercises. So it's essentially like, imagine you have a client who really just doesn't understand a particular cultural context. Now you can go there and do the ethnographic work and kind of represent that and bring it back. But sometimes you may want to bring the client to that space and have them experience it themselves. And we can organize kind of these immersive type guided tours, if you will. Those are the kind of things you got to do in person, I guess, obviously. You can do things remotely. So there are times when we do, but probably travel would be reserved mostly for that or for like when you're doing like a client workshop. But otherwise, in my role, there's just not a tremendous amount of it.
Gotcha. Well, switching gears, no pun intended, but I saw that you worked at General Motors and Ford. How did you use anthropology there?
Yeah. That's great. Well, I was at General Motors for a while as a designer. So I was in the design studio. I was an industrial designer. That's what my undergrad was, and doing automotive design. So I did a lot of interior work. And at the time, I was doing a ton of work for Chevy and GMC for the trucks and cars and whatnot. And we had done a research exercise where we worked with some anthropologists and went out to the field to really understand truck drivers. And as a designer, I hadn't done that before. So I was a bit of a tag along. So I went along on this, and it was pretty extensive research. I mean, we were out in the field for, I think it was almost 2 months, I think, in a bunch of different spots in the US, like really getting to know truck drivers. And when I say truck drivers, I'm talking about like pickup trucks, individual, like contractors or, people that have a pickup truck. And one of the things I learned among many about truck drivers is just that so many of our assumptions being designers were just like not relevant at all for the for the people who, this is why they do the research, right? This is why they go and do that. But, I'm not the target market for that. So my kind of intuition about what would make for a good truck is probably not going to be all that good. So this is why they organize research like that. In any case, getting to do that, getting to work with anthropologists and doing ethnographic work really kind of ignited kind of a passion for me. And I'm like, I got to be honest, this is where it's at. This is, how on earth could you design something without doing this? I want to be the guy that's doing this. This is great. So I went to university, to grad school, then while I was a designer, but then to learn about anthropology. And then the road was longer than I anticipated. It took about 10 years to get my doctorate, but I did. And then I had switched at that time to work at Ford Motor Company, but then I was working in a research capacity, but developing research that would help designers. So I worked in a number of organizations there and ended up building out a couple of research teams that we did stuff everywhere from, digital interaction and HMI and things like that, to user experience. We've done customer experience, product research, marketing and brand research, kind of touched on all of it. But that's where I really got to see like where anthropology would touch on all those things, because anthropology is pretty broad. So my subfield is cognitive anthropology. And what's interesting about that is there are no problems that are not well informed by a cognitive anthropological perspective, I believe. So for example, if you're doing something like developing interior controls and like screens and interaction in a vehicle, that's kind of the bread and butter of some anthropologists who are studying like cognition and studying how people understand and relate to machines. But all the way to doing something that's a little more upstream of that, like brand identity or brand positioning or kind of brand purpose type work. And then everything in between still connects really well to anthropology, just at a different level of abstraction. At that point, you're kind of talking about things like metaphors and cultural narratives and kind of we do a lot of semiotic work. So kind of what is that semiotic space that's inhabited by your brand and how does that connect? So I would say at every part of that development cycle, from the strategic portfolio development kind of brand positioning work all the way through to product execution and what is the styling of the vehicle or what is the control logic, that's all informed by anthropology.
With cognitive anthropology, to make sure that I have this correct, is it kind of where you're trying to make sense of something like does this work the way this works, and like why is this set up the way it's set up? So like, for example, architecture, the way our house was built, all the windows are in one corner of the house. And I'm like, how does this logically make sense instead of spreading the windows throughout the house? So would that be cognitive anthropology? It's wondering why they designed it the way they did?
Yeah, there is a bit of that. So there is kind of like a diagnostic kind of approach you could take, where you're looking at something like an artifact. So for example, cognitive archaeology does this really well. This is where that expertise really sits, is looking at some kind of artifact, that kind of analyzing it from that kind of cognitive perspective, archaeological perspective. And then you're finding out things, well, why was this thing made the way it was? And that tells you something about the people that made it. It tells you something about their ideas and beliefs, right? It can also be thought of in terms of not necessarily deconstructing kind of the logic of something that's made. Now, I guess when a customer, for example, in an automotive context, would encounter a vehicle, they might be doing some of that themselves, kind of making some inferences about who the designers were and why they designed it the way it is and what it means. But I think one way to look at it is there isn't any information that people perceive directly that isn't mediated by culture and their cultural context. All the information that people perceive, including things like how you interpret like iconography, or how you interpret like line and form, and some things that we kind of typically think are more directly perceived, are all mediated, right? And so, for example, let's say you're designing like a digital interaction system, and you talk to your customers and you say, well, what kind of system do you really want? And they say, well, I want something that is really simple and clean. We take these words for granted, but they can mean very different things in different cultural contexts. So, for example, simple and clean could mean something that references kind of minimalist aesthetics. It could reference things like neutral color palettes. It could reference a particular interaction model where maybe none of the functions are exposed. Everything is kind of sedate and tranquil until you engage with it. Well, that might be completely the opposite of another culturally infused idea of what simple and clean is, which may be something that is more draws on ideas from the science fiction, or maybe it draws on ideas from like, every control that you might need. You don't have to go through a menu to find it. It's all exposed for you. Well, that's a different idea of simple, right? And so one simple is it's completely blank canvas and you have to menu dive to get into it because it gives you kind of this serene aesthetic. Another idea of simple might be something that from the outside looks kind of more complicated, but there's no menu. It's just you're using all the controls. So that's just one example of how you would create something like an interaction paradigm that would be in some ways mediated by people's cultural ideas of what is behind kind of the language that they're using. And I don't know if that example just meandered too much from the question, but I think the long and the short of it is that people's inferences are going to be mediated by their cultural context. So that's the role of the cognitive anthropologist, is to uncover that and to reveal that and make that explicit so that when you're talking to someone, their model of what is good healthcare is interpretable by you, and you're sharing that same idea. Because people can have 100 different ideas of what good healthcare is, for example. So if you're working with a healthcare client and your customers are like, yeah, I really want a smooth kind of customer experience, what on earth does that mean? So it's these cultural ideas that then manifest in things like experience design or service design or architecture or what have you.
That makes sense. I've never thought of like cognitive anthropology as being like its own subfield, because it kind of feels like it touches on every branch of anthropology or is used within every branch. But it would definitely make sense that it would be a very useful tool, especially in business and research, because you have to think about like, okay, well, why was this created? What was its purpose? And how does it relate to the individuals who created it? And like, we're people, we create a whole bunch of different things for all different purposes. So I think it's something that hopefully most universities might add a class for of cognitive anthropology, because I don't think it's something that a lot of anthropologists are familiar with unless they're in the design and research sectors of anthropology.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to back up a little bit, I mean, I think I mentioned earlier there's a kind of the four-field approach. There's archaeology and kind of bioanthro and cultural anthropology and linguistics. But there are cognitive perspectives that are used across all of them. So I don't know if I think of it as a separate discipline so much as kind of a theoretical orientation toward the work and towards the type of questions you're asking behind it. But I can give you maybe a pretty concrete example of like where that matters, maybe, because it gets a little abstract.
Okay.
The cultural context of where, let's say, a design and engineering team is coming from is crucial for understanding what it is they're building, what ultimately that shape of the world is going to look like in the end. So I'll give you an example. One of the places where I think this question is really interesting is in the development of artificial intelligence. And what I mean by that is the assumptions of what an AI is, or what it does, or what it's for, or what it should be purposed toward. These are all cultural questions. So you may have an idea of something like the idea of intelligence and what is intelligence. Well, your kind of cultural notion of intelligence could show up in many different ways, right? You might say, well, intelligent is doing X, Y, Z. And someone else would be like, I'm sorry, no, I think of it as something completely different. And we're at a time right now where it's really crucial to understand the teams that are building these tools is to understand and kind of make explicit what their kind of internal assumptions are, what their kind of cultural models, their cultural ideas of what, say, the thing they're doing is, and the many different kind of cultural ideas that are out there in the public that are informed by a bunch of different things. Some of them are informed by sci-fi, some of them are informed by, ethics, some of them are informed by who knows. And what you wanted, well, a client would ultimately want to match these. Right. So the client's going to want to say, is our model kind of matching the model of the audience that we want to speak to? But even if you're not the client, you're still going to be interested in if these are kind of the tools that you're going to have to interact with and may have pretty profound implications on your life. For example, how you get a loan, or what kind of recommendations you get from a doctor, or what kind of nutrition regimen you follow, or whatever it might be. It may be consequential things. It's going to behoove you to really understand, well, what is the cultural model of the person who made this system? And what does that imply for the types of information that the system is providing? And how does that relate to my model? So untangling that, I think, is just a really critical thing that needs to happen.
That kind of cleared up some of the cobwebs for me, which is great, because I'm sure other people would also have questions on what that is. So when I was doing research on what you do, I noticed one phrase kind of pop up a couple times called neo-natural. What is that?
Yeah. That's a good one. Well, neo-natural, formally, like capital neo-natural, that was just a term that we came up with on our team in Space Doctors. There's a body of work that we had produced last year. And it was based on insights that we had been seeing popping up across a lot of different sectors for our different clients. And it was popping up in things like technology. It was popping up in things like life sciences. It was popping up in food and beverage, across all these different kind of domains. And what it is it's an idea that anthropologists are very familiar with, right? Which is this idea that culture and nature dichotomy is a bit of a false dichotomy. And it's this idea that kind of is reproduced in culture, that there is such thing as nature and there is such thing as culture. And these are fundamentally kind of opposed or in-tension things, and that they interact with each other in more or less positive or negative ways, or what have you. But what we're seeing across like a lot of these industries is that, anthropologists have challenged this dichotomy for a long time. They've always thought that this was kind of a very peculiar construction, and that a lot of people don't hold like these two as very distinctive categories, right? But we're starting to see that in commercial applications. We're starting to see that in like product design, and we're starting to see that in, for example, innovation in food, where companies are starting to really rethink like what it means for something to be natural. So for example, we can have this cultural idea of a natural farm looks like a forest full of trees, right? And a natural farm, like a tree farm, for example, does not look like kind of an interior of a warehouse with scaffolding, right? But what we're starting to see is, and this is just one example, but where things like you have a monocrop kind of space where it looks kind of like at a glance as though it's a natural thing. There's nothing natural about that. That's entirely kind of structured by human activity. When, forests just don't exist as complete like monocrops that then get harvested. Whereas you may have something that is, say, like a vertical farm, or something that is kind of a farm in a building that has much more diversity and variety, and maybe has kind of a different kind of environment that may not look like kind of a traditional natural environment, but may in some ways actually be a more kind of balanced ecosystem than the monocrop farm. That's just one example, but you see this also in things like what foods people eat and what people consider like natural eating, and what people consider like technologies that support ecological goals. So when anthropologists talked about like this dichotomy is false, well, you're starting to actually see that in commercial development, where the dichotomy is starting to break apart, where people are pushing the boundaries of, well, what does natural really even mean? And is this product in some ways every bit as natural as another one, even though if it doesn't follow the typical cultural model of that? So that's the long and short of it. I mean, I encourage anyone to, like, we put together a little booklet on it, and I think it's pretty inspiring. I thought it was cool. So absolutely check it out. But it's basically introducing this idea and saying, look, yes, anthropologists are very familiar with this idea, but I think a lot of our clients could really benefit from maybe challenging that dichotomy. And here are some real world examples of where people have done it. So check it out. That's my pitch for that bit. But that's what it is.
Yeah, and I'll definitely include that in your show notes so that people can, when they go to listen to your episode, they can click on it and be like, oh, this is what that means. So, has obtaining an anthropology degree kind of broadened your view and perspective on the world?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in a lot of different ways, I think. Well, I can give you two concrete ways, maybe, that it's changed my perspective. And this is part of what my dissertation was about, to kind of explain this. But I think a lot of times people's default kind of assumptions about cultural difference kind of fall into one or two buckets. And I think both buckets are wrong, basically. And anthropology is what helped me realize that these are kind of the wrong buckets. So bucket number one is that culture is basically like a veneer. It's like, imagine you bake a cake and the ingredients are all the same and the cakes are identical and you just decorate them differently. So people think of culture as like, well, it's the food people eat. It's the, outfits they wear when they do the diverse rituals that they may have. It's a language they speak. But fundamentally, humans are just humans, kind of this universalist idea, and that everything else is kind of just kind of a surface that layers on top of it. And for the most part, the surface layer is just entirely contingent. You could take someone, plop them in a different context, and put a different layer on them, and it's interchangeable. And in that sense, they view cultural traits, like the things that a culture produces, almost like Mr. Potato Head, that you could pluck off a nose here, pluck off an ear here, exchange them, move them around, that there's no kind of fundamental system to it, that it really is just like jewelry that fundamental human wears, right? So that's a one bucket. That's one model of the person, right? Then there's this other model of the person, which is like the other extreme, is a really essentialist idea. And it overlaps a lot with some racist ideas about different groups of people. But it doesn't always show up in racist ways. It kind of shows up all the time, that there are these like essentialist ways of being that are associated with a culture that are like incommensurate, or that they're fundamentally different, that there's something different about, like, it's the other side of the pendulum. And this is where you have these ideas like, there is like an American mindset, or there's a Chinese mindset, or there's a Russian mindset, or there's a French way of being, or whatever it might be, but then kind of takes that in some ways as like determinative in, explaining what people's behavior is. And that's like the other extreme. So the one extreme is that, people are all kind of just interchangeable, universal substrate, and they just have different like decorations. And the other one is, no, through and through, people are just fundamentally different. And, the Frenchman will never be anything like the whatever. Who knows? And I think in a popular imagination, this is pretty typical. You find variants on these that are pretty typical. One of the things anthropology has showed me, and one of the things that I explored in anthropology, is that I guess the obvious thing is it's a lot more nuanced than that. But I think what's interesting for an anthropologist is, okay, in what exact ways is it nuanced? And where does it matter? And where does it show up? And where are people share some kind of universal aspects of humanity? And there are absolutely cross-cultural human universals. And then where are there kind of cultural differences that are deeper than just what you wear? So for example, like how you think. So for example, even and this is a bit about cognitive anthropology, but the context you kind of grow up in informs the ways that you make inferences and the ways that your mind fundamentally works. If you imagine your mind is essentially like an associative network that is built off of metaphors and built off of associations and things like that. Well, the metaphors that you're acculturated into at some point become the structure of your mindscape, for lack of a better word, of what your mind is, right? So it's a much more interesting way to think about humans, because they're not just the generic humans. The way that the cultural context you grow up into fundamentally impacts how you think and how cognition works. But at the same time, these are things that are not absolutely essentialists, right? These are things that you are acculturated in. But the idea here, at least for me in anthropology, is that it gives a much better model, I think, of how to think about what cultural difference actually is. And it starts to invite these questions of like, well, where does it matter, and how much does it matter, and in what ways does it matter? That's just a much more interesting question and much more valuable information than kind of just defaulting into one of these other faulty models. So I mentioned that there were two things, and there's a long answer, and I apologize, but I would say the other thing that I think was a fundamental eye-opener for me in anthropology was the extent to which material culture matters in terms of people's ways of life and things like that. And in a sense, we kind of know that intuitively in the generic sense of like, well, if a group of people has technology A and a group of people does not have technology A, then for whatever value technology A has, this group of people is going to have that material advantage. Or we think about things in material economic terms. But what I really mean is that the embodied experience of someone within kind of this material reality that has smells and has textures and the impact that that has on your, and I'm going to use cognition, but I don't mean computational processing, but kind of affective experience of the world and the way that someone is in the world, the way they're being in the world, impacted by materiality, was something that, is weird. I think I was already inclined to that coming from design. So I kind of intuitively got it. But it wasn't until kind of I had that theoretical language to talk about it that it really started to click and make sense in a way that, at least for me, helped to articulate kind of how I understood a people in a particular context.
Cool. So, is there any advice that you would offer to individuals who are wanting to get a degree in anthropology?
Yes, absolutely. I think the best advice I could give would be to read and listen generously. There's a lot of different perspectives in anthropology. There are a lot of different theoretical points of view, and there isn't one way of behaving anthropologically or understanding the world anthropologically. So, for example, there are people who kind of take a more cognitive perspective, but there are people who don't. There are people who think that's baloney. There are people who might take, for example, like a very materialist perspective, and there are people who may take a very different perspective than that. I think the long and short of it is the best thing you could do is kind of listen to your classmates, listen to your professors, listen to the theory that you're reading, when you're reading an ethnographic work, for example, when you're performing ethnography, is to be as generous with maybe the theoretical perspectives as you would be with the people that you're learning about. And kind of be very comfortable trying to experiment and dabble with a lot of this, because you'll find a lot of different perspectives, whether it's, structural functionalist or, phenomenological or whatever. They will shed a different light on the material you're looking at. And think of it less like one is wrong and another is right. And think of it more as like, well, what answers are really trying to inform? What questions are they trying to answer? And I think that would be really useful. That would have been really useful for me, I think.
So, before we get to our final 4 questions, is there anything that we haven't discussed that you did want to talk about?
Yeah, I think there is. There's this one idea. Now, I'm a little bit biased. I came from a design background and before going into anthropology, and then I've been in anthropology, and I do work in commercial spaces. So I help people build things, and I help people build services and build brands and build, objects and things and whatnot. But I think the idea that I would love for people to take away is that the world is in fact creatable. And it's an idea that I got from David Graeber. He had mentioned this before, and David Graeber and David Wengrow wrote, Dawn of Everything, and this idea is explored through there. And it's this idea that if you look across the anthropological record, there's a tremendous amount of diversity in the ways that people live and the types of systems that they live in and the types of spaces that they build and the types of social relationships that they have. And I think it's really important to remember that, as powerful as path dependency can feel and seem, or as predetermined as it may look like our lives are in terms of, let's say, technological progress or political turmoil, whatever it might be. But fundamentally, there is a createdness of the world that we can participate in. And what I think is really interesting about that is, especially when we're looking at consulting and we're working with clients, is that even with things like technologies, like fundamental technologies, which may seem as though they are kind of pre-culture in some sort of like fundamental sense, are in fact not. So when we say things like, what is behind nuclear power plant? Well, there isn't such thing as a nuclear power plant that doesn't automatically entail things like a particular social structure, a particular scale of population and industry and things like that. That these are all deeply social things. Or when we look at something like an artificial intelligence, then artificial intelligence can be, in a lot of ways, what we make it to be. And to maybe guard against some of that taken for grantedness. The fact that things that you may encounter were developed in a particular context does not necessarily mean that that thing is beholden to that context, although in some cases it might, but also means that that context is in some ways also as part of the palette of things to be created as the artifacts themselves. This is getting a little abstract and rambly, but I guess the idea that I want to convey is that there aren't any things that are, again, not mediated by culture. And culture is unique in the sense that it is, in a lot of ways, contingent. So, I don't know. If you get a chance, read the Graeber and Wengrow book. You'll get a gist of the idea and how that kind of looks. But yeah, it's fundamentally the idea that one thing you learn as an anthropologist is that the world is very creative.
Okay. And we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but what is the best piece of advice you'd offer to someone, not so much who's going to school for this, but is currently interested in being in the same field that you're in?
There's almost nothing that isn't relevant to anthropology. Philosophy, theology, physics, nutrition, what have you. It's all going to be relevant. And I think the challenge that at least I had, like being an anthropologist or going through anthropology, is that you can never read it all. You just can't. You can't be familiar with all of the philosophers. You can't be familiar with all of the emerging ideas in physics. You can't be familiar with whatever may be bearing on the question you have. And I think the advice I would have is accept that early, because there's no way to get around that. You just cannot read all of the things. And start now working on your relationships and your networking. And I don't mean networking in the like corny, like salesy sense. I mean it in like building those people who maybe do have those expertise that you could draw on, you can collaborate with, that you can work with. And again, this goes back with this idea of just really being a generous listener. And don't try to fill in all that stuff on your own. It's just not going to be possible. But really what's more important is don't get discouraged by the fact that anthropologist A is talking about some theorist that maybe you never read before and it gets to you, right? Or anthropologist B is talking about why this current finding in physics really is really important for anthropology. And you're like, shit, I don't know what that finding is. I don't really totally get it. Great. Learn, read up on it, try to do it, but you're just not going to be able to, anthropology is a very diverse field. So you're just not going to be able to have full mastery of everything that bears on anthropology. So accept that and build your relationships around that.
Are there any changes you wish to see within the field of anthropology?
Well, of course, I have, that could be a whole hour conversation. We start with that. That'll be a whole different thing. I'll try to come up with a couple brief ones. I think that cognitive anthropology, and that's where I'm the Society for Anthropological Sciences. I'm on the board for that, and I'm very passionate about that. And I think there is great value in that, and but it's still relative small kind of niche in the anthropological world. I would encourage people to dive into that more. And one of the changes I like to see is to see more young people kind of getting into that and examining that. I think it would be a great change. I think another change I would like to see in anthropology, it's twofold. It's more public engagement. So anthropologists have a thing where they like to talk to each other, if that even. I think, I'm not even sure that they do, but there is definitely kind of a closed world that is anthropology. And it is just really difficult crossing over. And there's so much anthropologists could contribute to things like, whatever issues are going on in the news or whatever kind of debates are happening. There's just a tremendous amount of value that anthropologists could bring to that. And I would like to see more public engagement. All right. So the second thing that I would like to see in anthropology, which is a twofold thing, is more public engagement. And what I mean by that is there's so much in our world going on right now, whether it's events that are happening or public debates that are happening or, political realignments, whatever the case may be. There's a ton of value to be had from anthropologists actively engaging in that conversation and really bringing to those conversations, bringing to those debates kind of the perspective that anthropologists have, which is, kind of appreciating cultural diversity in a really nuanced way and understanding kind of the range of human being that can be habitable, right? But there's a second part of that too, which is I would like to see not just more public engagement, but more public debate within anthropology. So I think there's a tendency for anthropologists who are more activist to kind of fit in a particular mode of activism that, to be honest, will seem a bit hegemonic. It seems like, okay, I get where you're coming from. It's a very particular point of view. It's an ideology, if you will, right? But anthropology is really diverse, right? There are lots of different perspectives to be had. So I would like to see more public engagement in anthropology, more than there is currently, but then also more debate in public debate across anthropological perspectives, because there isn't any kind of one kind of very clear hegemonic understanding of how human culture works. In fact, there's quite a bit of diversity there, which makes it interesting. So that's what I want to see. That would be the second thing. So more engagement, but that engagement should look like it shouldn't come across as a single voice. It should be an active and engaged kind of dialogue and debate. I think that would be really good. It'd be healthy.
Perfect. Now, on the flip side, what do you just love about your job and the industry you work in?
Oh, I gotta tell you, kind of a lot of there's a lot I love about. There really is. I mean, I'll tell the first thing. I mean, this is gonna sound like a cop out because I think maybe a lot of people say this when you ask them about what they love. The first thing I love is the people that I work with. Frankly, they are some of the most interesting people that I've ever met in my life. They're just absolutely fascinating, and there's not a day that goes by that I don't learn something new from any one of them. So that's one thing I love, but that's not necessarily about the industry. In some ways it is, but as far as the industry, what do I love? The diversity of problems to solve. So one day I might get a question from a tech company that is, what is the future of AI? And I'm like, okay, that's a huge question. How come you don't know? You're literally the one building AI. And they'll be like, well, we kind of do know. But the problem is we know what we're building, but we don't know necessarily how people understand that in the world and how they will understand what we're building or how that presents itself in the world. Or will it be intelligible? Will it be baffling? Who knows? So there's a whole host of questions that are kind of buried in that it's like, okay, this is a great. So you might have that question one day. And the next question on the other day is like, all right, help us innovate pet food for aging dogs. And like, wow, okay, that's quite a different problem than AI and developing, let's say, like a chatbot that helps you like make medical decisions or whatever. This is a totally different thing. And then the next day you might have another project that is helping designing, I don't know. I don't know what it might be. It might be a healthcare service center. So the project can be really diverse, which is really great. And they always kind of present new and interesting questions that if you're an anthropologist, if you're any way involved with kind of the humanities or the liberal arts or the social sciences, you're going to kind of have that curiosity, I would imagine. That's why you went into those fields, that is constantly being kind of poked at, which to me, that's just incredible. That's what I love about it. So it's the people that I work with, super fascinating. And then the projects, the clients we have are just tackling some really interesting problems. Oh, absolutely love it.
I think there's so much to learn from anthropology. I feel like even if you were trying to answer a different question every single day, you would never run out of questions that need to be answered. So it kind of gives that vibe.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's one of the things. I mean, culture changes all the time, right? And you could describe cultural change in a couple of different ways, depending on your theoretical bent, whether it's dialectic or whether it's evolutionary or however you wanted to look at it. But it does change. And those changes really matter, like how people think culturally, how people behave culturally, kind of the how people structure their relationships and their social networks could impact some major things. I mentioned earlier about, for example, like a nuclear power plant. Well, whether your nation uses nuclear energy or doesn't, these are questions that are informed by culture, right? Whether you are allowing kind of unlimited development of artificial intelligence or whether you're putting in some kind of safeguards, and then what are those safeguards and what do they look like? These are all cultural questions. So there's never going to you're never going to run out of stuff to do. So that's exhilarating.
I agree. I would rather work in a field where you get new and different questions every single day because the culture is changing. Even if it's minute, it is changing every single day. You can never get bored with this field. There's always so much to learn.
Right. You got it.
Yeah. Well, our final question, where can listeners learn more about you and what you do?
Well,
honestly, you just ping me. Just send me a note. So, for example, you can find me on LinkedIn. That's probably, I should probably do more elsewhere, but that's kind of where I'm most at. Send me a note and I'm happy to talk about what I do at any point. Or yeah, that's probably the easiest way.
Perfect. Well, I had a great time talking about all things cognitive anthropology, space doctors, all that kind of stuff. And I hope you enjoyed talking with me as well. But I just want to say thank you for coming on here.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a real pleasure. I appreciate the conversation. It's fun.
Yeah, of course. Well, I hope you have a great rest of your night.
Thanks. You as well.
Thank you. All right. Bye. Thanks for listening to another episode of AnthroPuzzled. This show was produced by me and is distributed in collaboration with the American Anthropological Association. A special thanks to Cheyenne Brewer for editing the website, Leah Akers for the incredible logo design, and to AnthroPuzzled's intern Fiona for the episode descriptions. The music is courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear of Sound and Picture. If you have any questions, you can reach me at abby.letsinger@anthropuzzled.com or as AnthroPuzzled on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Until next time.